Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we are doing a deep dive into a book of the Bible that, let's be honest, a lot of people tend to skim through.
Or skip entirely.
Right. We're talking about the book of Numbers.
It definitely has a reputation for being, a bit dry, lots of lists, census data, that kind of thing.
But when you actually get into it and you look at the sources, you find that Numbers is just packed with these critical truths about who God is.
It really is. It's all about his character, his fierce holiness, and his sovereign plan for his people. It's a book about what it means to live in life and death proximity to the Almighty.
And that's the tension that really drives the whole story, isn't it? Our sources bring us right to this core paradox. You have this supremely holy God who has decided to, well, literally pitch his tent right in the middle of a sinful, complaining, rebellious nation.
And the question is, how does he do that without just consuming them? And how does that really volatile relationship square with the promises he made to Abraham centuries earlier?
That's the mission for this deep dive. We're going to try and chart that path from what looks like initial readiness to this catastrophic failure of an entire generation.
And yet it still concludes with the absolute certainty of a coming messianic king. It's an amazing narrative.
It really is. Numbers starts with the census, an army ready to conquer the promised land. But it ends 40 years later with a completely different army getting ready to cross the river.
So what went wrong? And maybe even more critically, why did God's plan still succeed?
Okay, let's get into it. And I think the best place to start is with the basic setup, the divine architecture, you could call it, because Numbers is all about establishing the lethal boundaries needed to sustain the presence of the king.
That's the perfect place to begin. The layout of the camp itself tells you almost everything you need to know.
So when you look at the language of the book, the focus becomes clear almost immediately.
Yeah, the source material points this out with some pretty specific statistics.
Go on.
The word tabernacle shows up 32 times in Numbers. And the phrase tent of meeting appears 54 times.
54, wow.
And that's more than in any other book in the Old Testament.
So that tells you right away, the story isn't really about the journey. It's not a travelogue.
Not at all. It's focused squarely on the physical and, the spiritual reality of God's special presence dwelling among his people, right in the middle of them.
It's a continuous story about proximity and the danger that comes with that closeness.
That's it. And those statistics, they lead directly to the geographic arrangement of the entire camp.
You mean the physical layout?
Yes. The tabernacle, which of course housed the Ark of the Covenant, was placed dead center.
Not off to the side, not at the front. Right in the middle.
Right. Yahweh dwells at the very heart of the nation. And this wasn't, for convenience. This was a required theological blueprint.
Dictated by God himself.
Dictated by the Lord to visibly, physically separate the holy from the unholy. If Israel didn't follow these exact instructions, they risked his wrath, or even worse, his departure.
So it's a kind of theological zoning ordinance. Their entire national life, their military structure, their social order, it all flows outward from that single point.
The presence of God.
And that point, the ark, that's the physical anchor for his divine kingship, right?
It is. The sources talk about the theological weight of the ark in a lot of detail. It's often described as the footstool for his feet.
A footstool.
Yeah.
That's a powerful image. It's like God's throne in heaven is extending down to earth.
That's a great way to put it. It establishes his immediate sovereignty over the whole assembly. The ark is the physical proof of Yahweh's royal rule.
Okay, that makes sense. And that also helps explain why the sources compare the ark to a royal standard, a king's flag on the battlefield.
It's a really helpful analogy for understanding Numbers.
So how does that work? Why is it like a standard?
Well, think about it. It clarifies the link between spiritual authority and physical location.
Okay.
When Israel was on the march, the ark and the pillar of cloud went ahead of them. It was like their advance scout, their guide.
The standard bearer leading the column.
Exactly. But it's more than just a guide. That standard, that flag, it marks the king's authority wherever it is.
And when the standard is planted,
it marks headquarters.
the center of command.
Precisely. The whole nation revolves around this mobile throne room. And this explains so much later on. Like when the people tried to attack the hill country without God's blessing,
They failed spectacularly.
they were cut down relentlessly. And the text tells us exactly why. It says, neither the ark of the covenant of the Lord nor Moses departed out of the camp.
They left the king's headquarters without his standard.
They did. They were basically launching an unauthorized skirmish, and they were deprived of divine favor. And their success was never about their own military skill.
It depended completely on the Lord's presence.
Solely on his presence.
Okay, so given that the whole camp is built around this volatile mobile throne room, the security system had to be pretty serious.
It had to be. And it wasn't about guarding God.
No, it was about protecting Israel from the lethal nature of his purity.
This is where the Levites and the priests Aaron's sons become so vital. They were assigned to set up their own camp immediately around the tabernacle.
They were a buffer zone, a protective barrier.
A necessary one. They were the security cordon between what the sources call the fearsome holiness of the Lord and the rest of the sinful people.
And the reason for this was made terrifyingly clear.
Oh, yes. The Levites' obedience was required to make sure that the Lord's wrath would not fall upon Israel.
They had to be vigilant. They had to prevent the people who were unholy because of their sin from just carelessly wandering too close to the sanctuary.
Because that would trigger judgment. And the rule was absolute.
Any outsider who comes near shall be put to death.
It sounds harsh to us, but this rigorous, lethal system was required. Why? Because Israel was radically sinful and God is absolutely holy.
So the Levites were protecting the people from defiling the sanctuary.
Which would force God to either break out in judgment or withdraw his presence completely.
This brings us to the actual logistics of moving the sacred objects. It's like the protocols for handling highly radioactive material.
That's a very apt parallel. The danger increases the closer you get to the core.
And who had the highest clearance?
Only the priests, the sons of Aaron. They were considered nearest to the Lord. So when it was time to break camp, only they could go into the sanctuary to ritually cover the holy articles.
The ark, the altar, the table. They had to seal them up for transport.
They're the specialists who handle the containment vessel, to use your analogy.
Then who comes next?
The Kohathites. They were a clan of Levites responsible for carrying the holy articles, but only after the priests had covered them.
And their job was incredibly dangerous.
Unbelievably so. Their rules were non-negotiable. They were forbidden from touching the articles directly or even looking at them uncovered.
Lest they die.
Yes. The sources really highlight this chilling detail. If they caught a glimpse of the holy things, even for a moment, they would be struck dead.
So they're the specialized transport crew. And if they breach the container, the spiritual radiation kills them instantly.
A perfect way to describe it. And as you move further away from the Holy of Holies, the danger level goes down.
Right. So the Gershonites handled the curtains and hangings.
Important, but not nearly as close to that core holiness as what the Kohathites carried. And then the Merarites, they were in charge of the heavy stuff.
The frames, the bars, the tent pegs, the structural components.
The most distant from the sanctuary's center. This whole system proves that no one, not even the most dedicated temple workers, got special privileges when it came to God's holiness.
And the most terrifying warning about this came right at the beginning with the destruction of Nadab and Abihu.
Aaron's own sons.
Their judgment was swift, immediate. It served as a lasting caution for everyone.
They offered unauthorized fire, and they died as a direct result of that fearsome holiness. Because the priests were closest to God, the expectation for obedience was the highest. They had to do exactly what the Lord demanded.
Their deaths really established the principle that your job title, your family line, it offers no protection from God's holiness.
None at all. They were the chief engineers of the sanctuary, and yet they were consumed when they stepped outside the boundaries of authorized worship.
It set the non-negotiable terms of access for the whole 40 years.
That's right. If the priests couldn't trifle with God's holiness, you can be sure no one else in the camp could either.
Okay, so we've established this architecture of lethal holiness. The camp is ordered, the boundaries are drawn, and then the narrative immediately pivots to the first census.
And this isn't just a head count. It turns the promise God made to Abraham into a verifiable data point.
It has a dual function then.
It does. It's both a verification of God's faithfulness to a past covenant, and it's a logistical preparation for the immediate future, for the conquest.
So that first census,
Yep.
in Numbers chapter 1, it came back with a massive fighting force of, what was it?
More than 600,000 men, aged 20 and up.
That number is just spectacular. And it's not just a military number.
No, it's a theological receipt. It's proof of a promise kept.
The Abrahamic covenant.
The Abrahamic covenant had 3 core parts: land, offspring, and a universal blessing. This census proved that the first of those promises had been achieved.
The offspring.
Right. The Lord had already fulfilled his promise of countless offspring made to Abraham. The multiplication had happened beyond any natural expectation.
And because it specifically counted the fighting men, it also proved military readiness.
Exactly, 600,000 troops. That signaled very clearly that this first generation was physically, numerically ready to possess the land.
Which was the second crucial part of the Abrahamic promise.
And that third part, the irrevocable blessing that gets secured later in the book through the unwilling testimony of Balaam.
We'll get to him.
Mm-hmm.
But God pledged that Israel would be blessed, and nothing could overturn that.
And that fixed nature of the promise, regardless of what the people did, is just central to the whole book.
So at the very start of Numbers, the sources show us a nation that is, well, it's mathematically fulfilled, it's militarily ready, and it's theologically secure.
They are perfectly poised to enter Canaan.
And yet, what follows is 40 years of almost nonstop failure and judgment.
And those catastrophic failures, the golden calf, the constant complaining, the fear at Kadesh, it all led to the judgment that this entire massive fighting force would die in the wilderness.
So 40 years later, after that judgment has run its course, the text basically conducts an audit.
The second census in Numbers 26.
And if the first census was the initial deposit, the second one is checking the balance after 40 years of spiritual mutiny, plague, and death.
Logically, you would expect to see an army that's been just, decimated, a population shattered by divine discipline.
But that's not what we find.
Not at all. What stands out is the consistency. The sources note that the head count was roughly the same as the first census.
So a whole new army had been raised. But numerically, the nation itself was preserved, still around that 600,000 mark.
And that consistency is powerful theological proof. It showed that the Lord had not abandoned Israel, even though he judged the individual failures with such severity.
The disobedient individuals died, but the nation as a corporate body was preserved.
Preserved through atonement and replenishment. It confirms the unshakable nature of the covenant with Abraham. The judgments were real and severe, but the inheritance promised to Abraham had not been revoked.
The mission to possess the land was just transferred to the children of that judged generation.
Let's use that bank account analogy from the source material. I think it makes it really clear.
Okay.
Imagine you audit a corporate account before a big financial crisis. That's Census 1. You confirm the account is robustly funded, say $603,550. It's ready for the big investment, which is the conquest.
Right. But then the crisis hits. The entire board of directors, the first generation mutinies, and the funds are seemingly lost through years of, bad decisions and embezzlement.
Which is the rebellion and judgment. But then you do the second audit, Census 2, after that original board is gone, and you find the owner, God, has personally intervened. The new balance is $601,730.
It's virtually unchanged.
Exactly. The original funds are gone, yes, but the balance is the same. The company is still solvent, still ready to launch the project. It proves the benefactor's resources are limitless, and his plan can't be stopped by human failure.
The statistical evidence in Numbers 1 and 26 shows that God's faithfulness is perfectly self-sustaining. The mission was delayed, but the promise wasn't canceled.
Which brings us to the devastating question. Why? Why did that first generation fail so completely?
The sources call their failure paradigmatic.
It is. It's a recurring pattern. A severe warning for anyone who claims to be part of God's covenant. Their exclusion wasn't a military failure, it was a spiritual one.
A fundamental rejection of God's lordship.
And the core sin, at the heart of it all, is identified as a failure to believe in God's goodness.
The sources call this the Eve complex.
They do.
What exactly do they mean by that? Is it just about doubting God's word?
It's deeper than that. It mirrors the temptation back in Genesis 3, where Eve was led to question God's benevolent intentions for her.
Okay.
In Numbers, the people were persuaded that God had evil intentions for their lives. They looked at their miraculous liberation from Egypt, and they concluded it was a cruel trap.
They literally claimed he brought them out only to slay them with the sword.
At every turn, they questioned his goodness. Lack of food, lack of water, fear of enemies.
So by constantly complaining, by wanting to go back to the slavery of Egypt, they were doing more than just being difficult.
So much more. They despised the Lord himself. They rejected him as their gracious king. They actually preferred the perceived security of bondage to the future their deliverer was offering.
And this leads to what the source material identifies as the fundamental flaw.
That this generation lacked the Holy Spirit.
And that spiritual deficiency made them blind.
It drove them with an amazing blindness and a selfish will that just overruled any kind of logic.
And this is contrasted so beautifully with Moses. The sources define him as truly a man of the Spirit.
And that's characterized above all by his meekness. His spiritual health meant he was not defiled by a selfish will.
Right. When some others started prophesying outside the designated place, Moses wasn't jealous.
His response was, "I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets." He wanted them all to share the Spirit. He stood as this one Spirit-filled exception in a generation that was spiritually lacking.
And their blindness was just shocking. I mean, after God executed judgment on Korah's rebellion, the people who were left actually blamed Moses for the deaths.
They irrationally blamed him for what God had done. They saw the devastating result of God's wrath, but they completely failed to see the justice of their own sin that provoked it.
This all comes to a head at Kadesh Barnea. This is the dramatic turning point for the whole book.
It's the formal start of the judgment. The spies come back, they confirm the land is bountiful, just as God said.
But the people become paralyzed by fear of the inhabitants.
And that paralysis wasn't just a lack of courage, it was a remarkable failure to believe that the Lord, who had just destroyed Egypt's army and was feeding them supernaturally every single day, could conquer the inhabitants of Canaan.
They called it a futile endeavor. They wanted to elect a new leader to take them back to Egypt.
And the judgment that followed is one of the most severe in Scripture.
God sentenced the entire fighting generation, everyone 20 and older, to die in the wilderness.
Which sounds incredibly harsh. But the source material focuses on the judicial irony of it.
How so?
God paradoxically fulfilled their own fearful complaint. They had been shouting that they were going to die in the desert because God brought them there to kill them.
So God said, okay, you will. He let their fears become their reality.
It's a stark warning that God sometimes allows sin to consume itself, and the children they were worried about, the ones they thought would perish.
They were the very ones who survived and inherited the land.
This whole rejection of God's prescribed order is also the context for Korah's rebellion. And this wasn't just, a political coup against Moses.
No, it was a rebellion against the divine order itself.
Korah and his associates, they were arguing for a kind of radical egalitarianism. They claimed everyone was equally holy.
So they were all equally entitled to the priesthood, to Moses' authority.
They were rejecting the whole graded guard of holiness we talked about earlier.
That's a profound theological rejection. It's trying to approach a holy God on your own terms.
It's a direct challenge to God's lordship over his own house.
And the judgment was absolute.
It confirmed the lethal nature of holiness when approached incorrectly. Korah and the main instigators were swallowed by the earth. A direct, visible judgment.
And the 250 followers who tried to offer unauthorized incense were consumed by fire.
The ferocity of that judgment showed that rejecting God's prescribed hierarchy was a very serious, premeditated sin.
So after they get their 40-year sentence, the first generation's final act is this tragic attempt to invade the hill country anyway.
A true act of defiance and presumption. It was a reckless, unauthorized invasion. They thought they could override God's judgment by sheer willpower.
And the defeat was instant and total. They were cut down relentlessly.
And the reason for their failure ties directly back to what we said in Section 1 about the royal standard.
It's explicitly... Okay, so despite this overwhelming failure of the first generation, the narrative shifts entirely in the later chapters. It shows that God's plan is still marching on.
And this is where the Balaam oracles come in. And they contain some of the most startling, beautiful prophecies in the Old Testament.
The Balaam incident is just a fantastic illustration of God's sovereignty overruling human will.
It really is. You have Balaam, who is a non-Israelite prophet, and he's been hired by King Balak of Moab to curse Israel.
For a hefty financial reward.
Right, and Balaam desperately wants the money, but he finds himself completely unable to utter a curse.
The sources are really clear that he was utterly constrained by the Lord to speak only what God commanded him to speak.
The mechanism is very specific. The Spirit of the Lord took hold of Balaam and spoke through him. This ensured that the blessings he pronounced were irrevocable.
Balaam had no control. He was just a mouthpiece. God forced the enemy's prophet to bless Israel.
And the irony is just wonderful. Balaam, who prides himself on his spiritual discernment, on his ability to speak with God,
he has to be instructed by his own donkey.
It's an element of divine comedy. The donkey knew better than he did what the Lord was doing.
It's an amazing image of God using the most absurd means, an animal, to shame this esteemed prophet and reveal truth to him.
And the end result is this powerful affirmation of the Abrahamic promise delivered through the mouth of a pagan mercenary.
The Lord confirms the promises of innumerable offspring, a future victory.
And it demonstrates that the blessing rested entirely on God's sovereign will, not on Israel's actions or Balaam's intentions. No external force, no spell could counteract God's blessing.
And these oracles, they look far beyond the immediate battle with Moab. They point to the ultimate fulfillment of the covenant.
They do. They give us this royal foreshadowing of the Messiah. The coming king is signaled through both structural and prophetic clues right there in Numbers.
We saw the structural one back in section 1, the camp arrangement itself.
Correct. The tribe of Judah was given a special place in the camp to the east of the tabernacle, which was the primary direction of the march.
And the sources say this was intentional.
It was designed to forecast the truth that a king would come from it.
And then there's the specific oracle that Balaam speaks, predicting a scepter and a star would arise from Israel.
Which confirms the royal expectation that was established all the way back in Genesis 49.
And the messianic trajectory here is very explicit.
Very. This king will crush the forehead of Moab, and our sources immediately connect that to Genesis 3.15.
The offspring of the woman crushing the head of the serpent.
So this elevates the conquest from just a local land dispute to a cosmic victory over evil itself.
The king from Judah isn't just about winning territory. It's about a global spiritual dominion.
Absolutely. And the reign of this king is associated with a return to Eden. The prophecy describes a paradise comparable to Eden, with language about flourishing gardens.
So the physical conquest of the land was always pointing to something bigger, a spiritual restoration where God's lordship over the earth would finally be realized through his king.
And the sources confirm that this prophecy finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus the Christ. The immediate audience might have looked toward David, but the ultimate vision was of Jesus.
So the narrative has to close out the era of that first generation. And that means dealing with the fate of Moses.
Right. Despite his unparalleled intimacy with God, Moses himself was barred from entering the land.
Because he failed to display the Lord's holiness at Meribah, he struck the rock in anger instead of speaking to it.
His exclusion proved that his special stature, his decades of faithful service, offered no special privileges. The law applies equally to the prophet as it does to the common person.
Moses had to die outside the land as a demonstration that all human leadership is mortal and fallible.
And that the standard of holiness is absolute.
So with Moses gone, leadership transitions to the champion of the surviving generation, Joshua.
And the source material is very intentional in describing Joshua's qualification. He is defined as a man of the Spirit,
which ensures the continuity of Spirit-led leadership and contrasts sharply with the spiritually deficient generation that died.
And this transition has a profound typological significance for us. The sources note that Joshua, whose name means the Lord saves, anticipates the new Joshua,
Jesus, who provides a better rest than the physical land of Canaan ever could.
The pattern is established. The failure of the old order, symbolized by Moses the lawgiver, is met with the provision of new, spirit-led leadership, securing the inheritance under God's fixed promise.
The promise moves forward, just under a new, better covenant head.
So as we wrap this up, we've tracked the lethal architecture of holiness, the statistical proof of God's faithfulness, the failure of unbelief, and the certainty of the coming king.
Now we can synthesize these points around two core insights. First, the provisions necessary for fellowship with God, and second, the tension between conditional obedience and the irrevocable covenant.
The reality is that God simply could not continue to dwell in the midst of Israel without establishing ways to deal with their sin.
And Leviticus, which comes right before Numbers, provides the theological explanation for how a holy God can live with a sinful people.
Right, and Numbers then gives us these practical examples of how that works. The first, of course, is the necessity of sacrifice. This had to be continuous.
The daily offerings were described as a pleasing aroma,
which wasn't just a ritual. It actively worked to avert God's immediate wrath and enabled him to remain in their midst without consuming them. It was the divinely provided way to cover corporate sin.
There was also the provision for daily purification, the ashes of the red heifer, for example.
This was mandatory maintenance for the community. Refusing to be cleansed wasn't a minor issue. It risked defiling the Lord's sanctuary, which would lead to being cut off from the assembly.
It shows how seriously God took the physical presence of defilement.
And then you have that startling, counterintuitive provision for salvation, the bronze serpent.
The people complained, God sent fiery serpents as judgment, they confessed, and God provided this strange solution.
Those who had been bitten by judgment were healed just by looking at the bronze serpent on a pole. It required this radical trust in God's specific, seemingly irrational promise.
The sources are clear that this is a direct picture of salvation by faith alone, even in the middle of judgment.
We should also mention the zeal of Phinehas at Peor. When Israel fell into idolatry and immorality, his decisive action made atonement and stopped a plague that had already killed thousands.
So all these examples show God continually providing ways to deal with the immediate sin of the people, so that his presence and the long-term covenant could both remain intact.
And that brings us to the final tension. The book of Numbers holds these two truths together. On one hand, Israel's disobedience did not mean the Lord would cancel his promises to Abraham.
The irrevocable covenant, the land, the offspring, the blessing, the king that stands firm.
That's the security of God's sovereignty. No enemy king, no sorcery, no human rebellion could ever stop God's fixed decree. It depends entirely on him. However, the failure of that first generation is a terrifying warning. Their story stresses that just being part of the covenant community, just being in the camp, doesn't guarantee your final inheritance.
It highlights the conditional obedience required of the individual within that unconditional framework of the covenant.
Enjoyment of the final inheritance requires persevering faith and faithful obedience. Those who kept trusting, like Joshua and Caleb, were preserved.
At the end of the day, the book establishes that access to the Lord and victory in his service are granted only on his terms.
It requires radical dependence, personal purity, and a fixed belief in his good character. The final outcome is secure because of the king who comes, but the individual warning remains sharp. Only an obedient people who live under God's lordship will enter that spiritual rest. And that's a truth we find established in the Westminster Confession. Our only way to stand before a holy God is through the perfect work of Christ.
So here's a final thought for you to consider as you reflect on this deep dive into Numbers. If the visible presence of God, the cloud, the ark, the fire, required such stringent, lethal boundaries for the physical army of Israel to survive, what does the gift of the Holy Spirit dwelling within you, the individual believer, tell you about the measureless, incomprehensible grace required to sustain your life and guarantee your eventual inheritance?
A worthwhile question to carry forward. We'll see you next time on Reformed Thinking.